this is gonna be controversial a little bit. Before we continue with the video, I had to say that one, I agree with 99% of the things that Sean Carroll has said when it comes to his philosophy, his metaphysics and ontology. He and I share basically the same metaphysics. The only disagreement would be consciousness, personal identity, and to a lesser extent, his understanding of philosophy of science. Like, for example, he is a reductive physicalist. I am also a reductive physicalist. He is an atheist. I'm also an atheist, right? He subscribed to psychological view of personal identity. I subscribe to a psychological view of personal identity. He is from the B theory of time. I'm also a B theory of time. He is a compatibilist. I'm also a compatibilist when it comes to free will, right? Our main objective is gonna be focused more about consciousness. Uh, like I said, his view of consciousness, he is from weak emergism, which, if you saw my videos, I already spoke of this, how he was wrong about that. And like the majority of neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists and psychiatrists, they are functionalist, computationalist view of consciousness, because that's where the evidence points. In fact, the very existence of AI is the reason that we have functionalist and computationalist at dominant position. In fact, current AI right now does possess consciousness on the insect level, and the new chatbot GDP, the other similar systems, are to some extent understanding what are they are saying. So like we are very close to artificial general intelligence. There are some people who say it's not possible, but it's mostly from a philosophical point of view. For example, if you are a non-naturalist, then general artificial intelligence cannot be the case, because for you consciousness itself is not something within the natural world. You know, regardless whether or not it's a functionalist computationalist thesis or the mind brain identity thesis, which nobody is subscribing to that since the 1950s, unless you are atheist apparently, because for some reason atheists don't want to subscribe to computationalism. Este, yeah, but also like for some reason as well, like Carroll also said is they also we should reject falsification, which is again the biggest mistake in science, because the scientific method was first established for the first time in the 2nd century during the Roman Empire by the combined works of Hero Alexandria, Ptolemy the astronomer, Galen the physician, and the Pyrrhonian skeptic philosopher Sextus Empiricus, where the combination of methodological naturalism, empiricism, adaptive reasoning, a post priori reasoning, experimentation, falsifiability, probability like Bayesianism, este, fuck, I forgot the name of the other one, Freudian skepticism. These are the foundations of science. Yeah, even though to follow the Roman Empire, this method, all these things, Freudian skepticism, empiricism, a post priori, falsifiability, Bayesian probability, all stuff like that, was lost, and was it reintroduced all these things back together until the 1960s by Karl Popper, because even when the scientific method was reintroduced, falsifiability wasn't yet reintroduced within the method until Karl Popper came in. When people criticize falsifiability, they're talking about naive falsification, not, if you talk about naive falsification, yeah, of course it's wrong. But falsification is one of the best methods ever established to understand how to make a good science. And for some reason, he wants to reject that. In fact, this is not a problem exclusively to Sean Carroll, like many physicists. It's like, instead of trying to falsify their theories to see whether or not they're accurate to understand the external world, they just don't want to build models like world building. They just want to gatekeep a certain idea they want to hold on. A best example is one of his more recent works, right? Like peer review paper, like the quantum field theory, on which everyday worlds supersede, using in fact the field theory will basically say we know everything what is to know. now it's completely understood. This is false because there's so many things not yet understood. The connection between the quantum gravity, dark matter, dark energy, and even then, like, you're giving this like a omniscient type of statement. It's like you're like assuming that you're basically a god, or a view that you somehow discovered the code to break to understand everything. Yeah, that is a naive understanding of how science should be. Another example is about the zombie argument for physicalism, right? Although for me, the zombie argument is a flawed. I consider it the nonsensical in many cases, right? But it doesn't change the fact that his approach to understand the idea is pretty flawed. I think the best example is from a response made by a philosopher named Matthew David, who is a process philosophy, a proponent of process philosophy. And I will read from the man himself. Contrary to the intent of most philosophical zombie arguments, Carroll attempts to sap the credibility of panpsychism account consciousness by arguing that, ironically, the railroad thought experiment only ends up strengthening the case for physicalism. The physical zombies will, of course, instead at least first-person introspective acquaintance with their own inner life that will claim to enjoy colors and sound and to feel deeply insulted by your opinion of them as mere mindless automatons, but they will be completely mistaken. Their verbal objective to our general conscious judgment about them will amount to nothing more than a casual determined notion of lips, tongue, vocal cords, diaphragms, and neurons. No one will be making the claim that will be amount to no more than the auditory outputs of a complicated machine. He correctly claims that the traditional zombie argument, if it challenged the credibility of physicalism alone, leaves panpsychists with a phenomenal sort of consciousness, and witness with no will, a ghost with no way to actively participate in the physical process. Admitting that consciousness is a phenomenon leaves the panpsychists with way less explanatory leverage against physicalism, says if consciousness makes no difference to the ongoing of the physical world, then scientifically speaking, it's not worth bothering about. He admits that dualists will still argue for the irreducibility of phenomenal consciousness to physics, almost implicitly admitting that dualism may have a chance, but due to the incoherence of the dualist ontology at the moment from an empirical point of view, we can set the position to the side. On the other hand, consciousness does have some strongly emerged downward causal role to play in how the body behaves. Then, according to Carroll, that would mean that the very well-established core theory of physics is wrong. Electrons can't break the laws of physics just because the mind hunting my brain tells them to. In the background is Carroll's claim to possess a complete theory by means which the behavior of the physical world can be deduced. The problem with this sort of model-centrism is that it entirely neglects the historicity of our universe, implies some sort of outside God's eye view. He emphasized that timeless impulse laws begs the question of their status in an otherwise entirely reductive physicalist cosmos. Like Lee Semmelweis and earlier philosophers like the father of pragmatism Charles Sanders Peirce and one of the greatest philosophers in process philosophy, Andrew Whitehead, I find more coherent to organize the cosmos as an evolving process with laws arising and widespread habits alongside the emergent entities and supplying them. As the complexity of emergent entity like atoms, star, galaxy takes shape to progressively constrain the future course of evolution, but nothing in the core theory, as I understand it, predicts the emergence of life or mind. This is not to say that the core theory somehow rules out the possibility, just as it renders these phenomena exactly unlikely, even miraculous. For the core theory to be consistent, a truly complete theory of everything, it will need to account for its own condition of possibility, which is to say, it will need to describe universe where creatures capable of developing a core theory will evolve. Short of this, the best way we could say about the theory is that it accurately describes the goings on in particular domain of relevance. It is an abstract model to describe the physical world as if life and mind did not exist. Breaking these higher level phenomena for the purpose of developing workable models of simple phenomena is perfectly fine. Physics has been widely successful in doing so, but turning around to trying to explain away consciousness and doing the explaining as though it were nothing but a successful way of talking about physical behavior reeks of model-centrism. Now, to be clear, I am not suggesting that conscious agency in any way contradicts the accounts of particles fields offered by the core theory. Electrons, for instance, need not disobey the equation of physics to nonetheless be subject to different probability distributing resulting from the unique, highly evolved physiological environment of the mammalian nervous system. The point is that context matter. Laws are not imposed on nature from an internal mathematical heaven. They are descriptions of statistical behavior of entities in various environments and various levels of organization. But back to the zombie argument, the point of this thought experiment, as I understand, is not to prove that consciousness is necessarily something extra above and beyond physical, nor am I convinced by Carroll's ironic reversal that somehow it cements the strength of the physicalist account. I think it is helpful to cut to the chase by putting the zombie argument in an evolutionary context. If consciousness evolves, then it cannot be a phenomenal, so in that case, it will play no role in the organism's behavior and thus offer nothing for the evolutionary process to select and enhance. So if we put dualism and idealism to the side, although it is not entirely fair for the idealist, but moving on, then consciousness must somehow be casually effectuous, i.e. must be a real feature of the physical world. But if matter/energy is constructed in the abstract terms that model centrism insists upon, then it is not at all clear how to bridge the gap. This is why we have the hard problem of consciousness, although me personally, I do not believe there is a hard problem of consciousness. The solution, I argue, is for the first to admit that physics offers a highly predictive but nonetheless abstract account of the isolated behavior of fields and particles. There is nothing in this model that suggests the universe should ever come to life or to wake up or start consciously reflecting upon itself. Thus, the model needs to be placed in a broader cosmological context. To resolve the hard problem of consciousness, what we traditionally meant by matter and by experience needs to be rethought, such that the two are understood as the outside and the inside of one and the same unfolding reality. Thus, allow us to make a continuum that will otherwise remain rather glaring ontological scam. In the simple form of self-organization like electrons, protons, and the atomic elements, they symbolically and compose follow extremely regular predictable patterns of behavior, does not rule out the possibility that these behavior are expression of something called vector field using Whitehead's process philosophy terminologies. What physicists describe mathematical as gravitational field may be experienced by the field question as gravitational feelings. And another interesting example by Moxie, who also made a critique of his understanding of this top-down God's eye view of physics that Carroll trying to do, where Sen points out, it said, if you do ask contemporary scientists why a table is solid, they will give you an explanation that comes down to the properties of a molecule which is made, which turn reflects the combination size of the atom determined by quantum mechanics and the electrostatic interaction between those atoms. If you were to ask why the sun shines, you should get a story in terms of protons and neutrons fusing and releasing energy. If you do ask what happens when a person flexes a muscle, you hear about signals sent through the nerve by transmission of iron across electromagnetic potentials and various chemical interactions, and so on with innumerable other questions about how everything phenomenal work. In every single case, the basic underlying story, if it happened to be that you're interested in it, again, there are plenty other interesting things out there, would evolve the particles in the standard model, interacting through electromagnetism, gravity, and nuclear forces, according to the principle of quantum mechanics, general relativity. As simple as they sound, what he's really trying to say, it certainly appears that he has implied that one can draw a direct line from the standard model via equation that is now rolling out in his tour in England. Well, not recently, but this is like 2013, but you get my point. To door closing and muscle flexing. Yet when everyone challenged him on the fact that the emergence of complexity, not to mention quantum classical contrasts, are not sufficiently well understood, had his supporters dismissed the argument as tiresome, but he has fallen in his own trap by overextending the validity as a theory. Let's review what we know about the question. 1. We know that classical physics and the classical part is crucial, that describe how things like doors open and close buildings stand up and so on an everyday level. This involves Newtonian mechanics. Thus, we know how macroscopic objects work on non-revolutionary emergence and speeds to great precision. We know the classical physics of electromagnetism. We know that helps govern how microscopic objects interact, and when you press on the door, it is really a electromagnetic repulsion between molecules that mediates the interaction between your hand and the door. 3. We know that classical physics and microscopy are relativistic energy to a great precision. 4. We know that quantum physics tells us how molecules are held together, chemistry. 5. We know that quantum physics tells us about the subatomic particles that make up the atoms and those molecules and the cause of these things. And we know the QED and the QCD. What we don't know, well, for starters, we do not know where quantum world ends and the classical world begins. In other words, we are not 100% certain how number 4 and 5 above connect number 1, 2, and 3. For example, Sin's equation seems to imply that space-time gravity, at least as it regards everyday objects, is entirely explained by two terms he identifies in the equation. But his equation is fundamentally quantum in nature. How can one include a gravitational term in a fundamental quantum equation and claim it explain all the physics underlying everyday life when we have yet have no well-developed theory of quantum gravity? And the problem of his theory of the effective field theory of everyday life is based on local realism. And now we know recently that local realism is not true anymore. So, his entire metaphysical foundation is shattered by this simple fact. But he will keep saying he will always revise, and somehow claim that his position is correct. We do know for certain that the gravitational interactions that affect everyday life can be traced to that one term. Sin claimed we don't understand the full theory of quantum gravity, but we understand perfectly well at the everyday level. Really? That's a rather tall claim likewise. By including a group of terms broadly labeled as quantum mechanics, he is implying that we fully understand quantum mechanics at least as regard to physics of everyday life. Presumably, all of chemistry come out of this particular set of terms, but there are an awful lot of things about quantum mechanics that we just don't know. C has conveniently brushed over some of the more complex aspects of biology and his description of muscle flexing. But there are legitimate questions that could be asked about just how some of these neurochemical processes can legitimately come out of those terms. In his equation, thus, if I reluctantly granted him the gravity claim, he's dodging certain problems with biochemistry by claiming criticism when his point is tiresome. Like I said, it is very problematic. It's basically an example of cherry picking to an extent. Aside from rather numerous labels, term other forces, he also failed to account for the certain interpretational problem inherent in the standard model, some of which had direct bearing on everyday life. It's been argued that there is an interpretational problem with the exclusion principle. As we understand, the standard model only explains 3 of the 4 fundamental forces of nature, which is already a problem what seems trying to claim. Nevertheless, we assume the extension of the standard model will someday include gravity. As a quote, the 4-dimensional interaction will each be accompanied by a mediator, particle of the photons for the electromagnetic vector pulsar, so W plus, W minus, and CO. For the weak nuclear, gluons for the color, gravitons for the gravitational. Higher order microscopic interactions such as strong nuclear possess their own mediated particles, the meson. One can theoretically use these as a building block for ordinary microscopic matter with one glaring exception, the extended structure of the atom. In addition to the 2 of the fundamental interaction, building an atom requires an invocation of the Pauli exclusion principle. The PAP may be understood in the context of the standard model via the spin-statistic theorem. Fields ultimately possess certain communication properties that manifest themselves after the action of a field operator as boson or fermions, the latter obeying PEP. In other words, we will find that a certain field has to be commuting or perhaps anti-commuting, or else we get in the world of Tony Sin a non-vanishing piece of junk in our mathematics. As Tony C., another scientist, puts it, it is something said that because of electromagnetism you do not sink through the floor, because of gravity you do not float to the ceiling. You'll be sinking or floating in total darkness were not for the weak interaction which regulates stellar burning. Without the spin-statistic connection, electrons would not obey Pauli exclusion. Matter would just collapse. Now, here's the deal. We often content the physics of everyday life with the physics underlying everyday life, but sometimes we have trouble. In the former, we like to do things such as draw free body force diagrams to describe how the force action of a microscopic object balance out. While the following example is not part of everyday life, it is illustrative of the problem. since we know that the exclusion principle plays a major role in keeping all the matter from collapsing in of itself. Consider a stable microscopic chunk of a white dwarf star. Now draw a free body diagram of that chunk. In the radial direction, there is a course of force due to gravity acting in a negative r direction, so I can draw an arrow and label it. Now, there ought to be an equal magnitude arrow pointing in the opposite direction since the chunk is stable, but there isn't because there is no force preventing collapse. It is the PAP that prevents collapse and acts against gravity, where the PAP in the standard model is not a force. The example is simply illustrated. A similar argument can be made about all of matter. As another scientist Tom Moore said about the Pauli exclusion principle. Give us a joke. Does present a problem for the interaction picture that is painted by the standard model. Within the realm of the standard model itself, there is no problem, but this is precisely where seeing Carroll falls into his own trap by over-extrapolating the realm of applicability of a theory. The interaction picture of the standard model match up well with standard Newtonian physics, except for this one case, and we do not yet know why. This alone should be enough to refute seeing Carroll's specific metaphysical claims that his core theory of effective field theory gives a complete explanation of everyday life. The claim is dubious at best, and at worst is misleading enough to belittle even the best science journalists, especially when it comes to for someone as famous as seeing Carroll. Some will argue he does this to sell books, but I doubt that because he's a scientist who wants to teach science. But he actually believes his claims. Especially he's a model defender of the ever interpretation of quantum mechanics, which heavily relies on local realism. And now we know local realism is not true. His own particular multiverse is not true by consequence either. Either way, it's another case of particle physics and cosmological community making grandiose claims that are eaten up by the public, giving the impression that this subfield of physics has a monopoly on truth, particularly when it comes to fundamental questions. And not only is that wrong, but potentially harmful to science. By the way, just because we have an equation, that doesn't mean we have understanding. If we don't believe, then Google interpretation of quantum mechanical wave function. It gives you a good picture of what I'm trying to get at. Another scientist and philosopher who also did an amazing explanation of quantum mechanics criticizes seeing Carroll and other scientists who try to do local model centrism, who gives basically a Gauss perspective of reality where it's just fixed. My disagreement with him is more of his metaphysical ontological claims. He is a proponent of Whitehead's approach to process philosophy mixed with pragmatism, right? And although I do not subscribe process philosophy, at least the more like other metaphysical ontological statements, but regardless. There are scientific disciplines out there that are in state of fundamental crisis, but unless you have moderate degree expertise in those fields, it is unlikely you know about such crisis. I want to examine one, and that is monocentrism. The Homesian tic-tac quote above is hideous simplistic. One must already have significant theoretical commitment to play before any evidence can make its appearance as evidence. To decline to theorize entirely will not make one open to the facts and evidence. It will make one completely incapable of recognizing anything as a fact or as evidence. Nevertheless, it touched upon an important issue with model-centrism and model-centrist thinking, namely the impatience for gathering data that leads some people to favor abstract theories without any regard how such theory might be tested or validated. Let's take a moment to notice a couple of areas where there is no real crisis: climate science and evolution. There is also discipline that do not suffer from model-centrist thinking. It is not because climate scientists and evolutionary biology are such sterling exemplars of the human species. Rather, the density of the evidence available to these studies is particularly high, so it is almost impossible for theory or the model to simply overwhelm the evidence via the brute force introduction and manipulation of parameters. There are too many facts gathered from too many sources, too many independent lines of evidence for the theory or model to become the central dominating feature of the research. Rather, it is the model that must conform to the data, which is a very, very good thing. Another way of saying this is that these are local science in the sense that data is not only contemplatively close to human experience, but it is rich and multi-threaded within that experience. And this will give some explanation. Number one, my use emphasis upon the term model is deliberate. the concept of model is important in both science and formal logic. While the use and intention of this concept are not identical in these non-identical pursuits, they are connected. Let us start with the abstract level of formal logic and the role of models there, because after all, being abstract, there is much simpler starting place that an incomprehensible, more complicated and nuanced realm of the concrete. In mathematical logic, model theory is about 1. A universe of discourse of one hand, and 2. The available term of discourse of the other hand, and 3. The relations between these two, although there's something that's soft and squishy that is not part of our discourse here. There are some marvelous whack and doodle crazy things that can be proven by this sort of abstract form of model theory, but for better or for worse, we don't have to go there. And to notice that 1, 2, and 3 are applicable to any form of inquiry. Whatever. There is the one thing slash problem slash situation we have talking about. 2. There are the available terms and concepts we choose to use and talking about, and the inquiry into number 1. And there is 3. The system of relations connecting number 1 and 2, such that number 1 is tractable and number 2 is meaningful. Formal model theory can indicate some deeper result, but the above glossary-wide model theory is only formal logic that has any substantial philosophical interest. And I'm going trying to not to sneeze. But suppose that now that your universe discourse number 1, then the thing you talk about is particularly thin, perhaps because the ratio independent observation is relatively small, while at the same time your tools for talking about the universe number 2 are particularly rich. Then the available choice for putting the two together, number 3, will significantly outrun the test you might apply in order to determine if you are appropriate in modeling number 1 with your instruments. In number 2, harkening back to the opening quote, you will be theorizing in the absence of evidence. People who do that, and who in fact do it a lot, will tend to become married to their models with little or now regard for actual evidence, especially if that evidence is really hard to come by. When this occurs, one has abandoned the real science for what is called model-centrism. This model is allowed to take center stage, and because there is such an abundance of tools in number 2 as compared to with the evidence for number 1, the model can easily modify so as to force the evidence to fit the model. This is exactly the situation facing in some areas in physics, often referred to particularly to Big Bang cosmology. It is difficult for an outsider to tell if this standard model is already in full-blown crisis or merely on the verge of one. The majority of scientists working in the field apparently do so without any sense that things are catastrophically wrong. Certainly, the triumphalist literature published on popular press by people like Stephen Hawking and Brian Greene provide no evidence that matter are fundamentally askew, but a little bit of digging rewarded the investigator with some astonishing revelations. For one thing, looking back at the history of the Big Bang cosmology and its root in Einstein's general theory of relativity, it quickly became evident that little effort was invested actually testing Einstein's theory as opposed to finding ways of confirming it. Alternative to Einstein was largely ignored with no real regard to their content or underlying purpose. This continues even now with numerous research papers being posted on the physics preprint website arXiv.org, but receiving little or no attention from the cosmology community. Physicist Michael Disney has observed that modern cosmology has permitted theory to run riot over observable evidence, and that one is entirely justified in viewing his current claims with skepticism. Physicist Paul Steinhardt has noted the aspects of the standard model of gravitational cosmology are fundamentally untestable and hence scientifically meaningless. This situation is so bad that astrophysicist Carroll has suggested we abandon the idea of falsifiability from our definition of science, but it will be amount to conscious elimination of any real empirical content from our theories, and various other scientists like Ellis, as well as Steinhardt has expressed a profound objection to such a boom. The simplistic reading of published criteria of falsifiability is totally unsupportable, but abandoning wholesale is frankly nuts, especially when to propose the content justifying a theory that otherwise lacking in empirical support. As Ellis and Silk observe in their comments linked to the they are going to put, will open the door to pseudoscience. Indeed, they should have observed such proposal had already been floated by proponents of creationism. Falsifiability is a guiding ideal, even when its complete realization in fact is largely impossible. Always and everywhere, the question that scientists must ask is how might I test this theory, and not how I might confirm this theory. Yet confirmation is what model-centrists are, invariably aiming at, whether they admit to the fact or not, because their model is so much bigger and richer than the limited range of actual evidence available. The model can be endlessly tweaked by adding or adjustment parameters, but it's not science, it is cosmology. Another problem will be called data density. This has been a topic also played between science and pseudoscience as well. If the For example, Alfred Whitehead, alternative to Einstein's general theory of gravity, was proposing theta in 1922. Yet, even though it fit the evidence every bit as well as Einstein's theory, in a couple of cases better, it was all but entirely ignored, with no effort invested in it by theoreticians. It is needed to be well and carefully noted that by the time it was supposedly refuted by observation, that refutation could only pretend to stand by ignoring the fact that Einstein's theory had been endlessly modified and parameterized so it would fit data, an advantage that Whitehead's theory never enjoyed. It should also be noted that although with only a halfway exception, he has been that Whitehead did not propose a theory, but he proposed an entire family of them. But again, no effort was ever expended in fitting Whitehead's theory to a relatively few independent observations available that was invested in guaranteeing the Einstein general relativity work. And this is no small reason for this blatant ideological disregard for the viable alternative that was given in small part of the shocking lack of meaningful evidence. The evidence, the observational data, and gravitational cosmology, they disturbingly thin. In comparison to other numbers of ways you can tweak your model to fit the data, just like Sinkov's core theory. The number of genuine independent observations almost vanishing few. Consider this analogy. Suppose you watch a single episode of a television series that you never seen before. But it's a pretty cool episode, but can you also use that single episode as a definitive guide for the scale of the writer/director? Suppose you watch the episode again, this time vary the sound, the picture quality a bit, and your television set. Do you really have any new information about the writer/director? Can you really make any definitive statement about the characteristic arc? Of course not. For that, you need multiple lines of independent evidence in order to formulate the intelligent sense of what the writer/director's style is skill. So, for example, to see all these things, and here's the problem with gravitational cosmology, and because it becomes acute. As a physicist, Michael Disney has observed the number of independent observations and separate episodes in separate series available in gravitational cosmology are significantly smaller than the number of ways, free parameter, which the standard theory we use to model cosmology can be tweaked, so it is never up against the embarrassing fact that it has been catastrophically falsified on any number of occasions. And here's the thing, that must be understood, every parameter that has been added to the standard theory of gravitational cosmology was put there precisely because it was discovered that the model failed to fit the observation. So many parameters have now been added to any unnumbered available independent observation, thus guarantee can be adjusted at whim to fit those observations with nearly arbitrary precision. Let us compare this situation which we find in climate science and evidence pointing towards anthropomorphic global warming. And to be honest, I don't want to deal with that, because let's be honest, it's just nonsense when we want to deny climate change in general. So no matter how much you modify, doesn't deny the fact that your evidence are weak or very far and few between. The professional consensus regarding the standard model of gravitational cosmology is probably just as high among physicists as the basic understanding among climate scientists. But unlike the situation in climate science, the evidence supporting the standard model of gravitational cosmology is so thin they have to be almost spectral. We are represented with a patchwork chimera that is incapable of standing its own feet. Model century is exactly the story of valorization of the model over data. One can identify sociological reasons for model centrism, but in the end of the day, it cannot be legitimized on anything like logical or scientific models. Model scientists are decisively anti-scientific, which is ironic, which since generally people who are considered scientists who are explicitly pushing for it can ultimately breed the Fox justification for overt pseudoscience. In fact, if you read his book, The Big Picture, which, by the way, highly recommend, great picture, despite my disagreements, there's another part, parapsychology. I know many people in the science community consider it pseudoscience, although because I'm more of a proponent of Freudian skepticism and Bayesianism, where the default position should be some form of agnosticism and neutrality instead of accepting or denying anything. parapsychology should be more accurately described as some form of pseudoscience, at least at the moment. And as another example by John, who the great critique of this understanding is C. Carroll's lack of understanding of parapsychology, on page 154 on the big picture, Sin discussed the work of ESP researcher Joseph Rhine, a professor at Duke University who mainly during the 1930s and 40s produced dramatic evidence for ESP. He created the impression that his work was a fluke that was never replicated, referring to the result that many attempts to replicate them fail. It does not mention any follow-up experience supporting Rhine's result. This misleads read on this topic. In general, subsequent experiments on ESP have been indeed replicated. Rhine's result provide very powerful evidence for ESP. In particular, the Gansfeld sensory deprivation experiment provided average result of about 32% in trials, which the expected chance was about 25%. A paper looked at a series Gansfeld study and concluded that the probability of getting the result was only 2 chances in 100 million. More recent tests with autistic children, such as scientist paper of Dr. Diana Hansen-Powell, have provided ESP results very strongly replicating Rhine's work, as have phone and email tests done by Sheldrake. Other than a handful of passive references, it shows no sign having studied anything related to the paranormal or psychic phenomena that we use these terms, but says nonetheless it declared the impossibility of parapsychological phenomena on the ground that are consistent with what he calls the core theory. He said and those concepts, the tenets of the core theory and the framework quantum field theory on which it is based are enough to tell us there are no psychic powers. And he later states the core theory of contemporary physics leaves no wiggle room for intervention by non-material influence, despite I mentioned earlier that he does not deny the dualist position that you can reduce irreducible consciousness to phenomenal phenomena, but from a very empirical perspective, we put that from the side to lack evidence. But what is exactly the core theory? In Appendix A of the book, it tells us that core theory is a physics equation, and is saying that the core theory is basically a complicated physics equation. To inputs and outputs of that equation are purely physical things, and none of its input or output are anything that is slightly bit biological, mental, spiritual, psychological. It is therefore absolutely false and ludicrous for someone to claim that the core theory has anything whatsoever to say about psychic phenomena. The possibility of intervention by non-material influence or anything whatsoever that is mental, spiritual, psychological, and even if there was such an implication, it would have little force because it admits that the core theory can't be the final theory. And he also said that the core theory is based on the framework quantum field theory, and is famous for making what is commonly called the worst prediction. And quantum field theory is famous for making what is commonly called the worst prediction in the history of physics, that the vacuum space should be super dense. Has seen Carroll admitted in the page 304, the idea that something so problematic can set reliable prohibition against completely unrelated things such as psychic phenomena or non-material influence, therefore doubly indefensible. He also discussed near-death experience and created no case of claim afterlife really have been subject to careful scientific protocol. Again, this is false. The near-death institute, who published the only peer-reviewed journal on the topic, will say otherwise, and the majority of experts of near-death experience researcher, most of them hold a metaphysical position of some form of substitutency, in contrast with the neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists who hold a reductive physical functional computationalist approach. At least 21 years has been physicians and scientists who have methodologically studied near-death experience using careful scientific protocol. For many years, the journal Near-Death Study has been published scientific paper on near-death experience, papers that have followed scientific protocol. The AWARE study published in 2014, which was funded by the United Nations, by the way, and also the AWARE 2 currently, is a study of near-death experience authored by a large group of scientific physicians. It followed careful scientific protocol and also produced some dramatic evidence resulting suggestive of a human soul that can leave the body. Although I do not will refer to call it soul, because we're talking about consciousness and personal identity, so I will say consciousness and personal identity persists beyond permanent bodily death. But he seems to have taken a look at the AWARE study, for his mention failed to verify out-of-body experience by using a particular technique involved visual stimuli placed above the beds of the people near the brink of death. But he fails to mention that some study reporting dramatic cases of someone who reported of an out-of-body experience while his heart was stopped. A person who reported very distinct detail of his heart attack resuscitation attempts that were verified. In this regard, his selected report found about his fairly as someone who might describe the Apollo program only by saying the Apollo program were trying to reach the moon, but the Apollo 13 mission failed without landing on the moon, without mentioning the Apollo 11 and 12 mission they successfully landed on the moon. And he also continuing in page 220, our status as part of the physical universe implies there is no overarching purpose to human lives, at least not inherent in the universe beyond ourselves. This is technically non sequitur, saying that one thing implies another when it does no such thing. This is the common problem with nihilism, at least from a more extreme metaphysical point of view. We're parts of the universe, so there is no purpose to our life. The first is one way implies the second. In chapter 26, he discussed evidence for psychics that the universe seems to be fine-tuned in a way that allows life to exist. He tried to discourage everyone who might conclude the universe was designed for life to appear. He also stated we don't know very much about whatever life would be possible if the number of universes were very different. This is entirely false. More than 25 years, scientists have been very carefully considering whether life would be possible if the number of universes were very different, and have made many relevant conclusions about the matter. We know that galaxies and sun-like stars would not exist if physical constants such as the gravitational constant and fine structure constant were different, but a relatively small amount. We know if there were a very thin difference between absolute values on the proton charge and the electric charge, that the planets could not hold together. The proton charge is the exact opposite of the electric charge, with the numbers of magnitude to at least 22 decimal places. We know that small changes in strong nuclear forces in one direction will make stable molecules impossible, and that small changes in another direction would have prevented the formation of carbon and oxygen, which life depends, at least carbon-based life. And we know that a tiny chance in cosmological constant of vacuum energy density would have prevented a habitable universe. We know that a very small chance in the neutron mass or the proton/electron mass, which will at least do a universe in which stars like our sun could not exist. To help to explain why we live in such a fine-tuned universe, while preserving, at least my position, which is atheism and reductive physicalism, Carroll suggested the idea of multiverse. There are many universes, which I agree with him on that point. I just disagree with his particular interpretation of quantum mechanics, and that the multiverse is simply a robust mechanism under which naturalism can be perfectly compatible with the existing life. Possibly a very vast correlation of other universes is not a simple assumption, but very much the flappiest. From the standpoint of Occam's razor, metaphysical parameter, yeah, especially his understanding based on local realism, yeah, that's another problem. And he also say if we get the multiverse this way, any worries about fun-tuning and system life evaporate. The word referred to these kinds that he's wrong suggests that the worries will evaporate in case of such a multiverse. That's because the chances of any one random trial is not increased by increasing the number of random trials. So the habitability of our universe was a gazillion to one shot before imagining a multiverse, is still exactly the same gazillion to one shot after you assume such a multiverse. In such a case, trying to do this gets even more difficult, because it's quite to the ever many worse interpretation. The crazy idea that the universe constantly split into different copies so that everything is possible happening in a vast collection of parallel universes. And he said there is a lot of love about Everett/many words approach to quantum mechanics, described as a lean and mean. No pretty much nothing you can imagine will be less mean. But the theory would probably no evidence for no reason for believing other than Lovely Fro's claim that it's lean, saying he rejects the afterlife based on naive understanding, at least to my understanding, because he just assumed afterlife equals supernatural, even though you can have a very naturalist approach to the afterlife, like quantum immortality, for example. He doesn't want to believe based on this naive understanding of this. And also, we have near-death experience, a form of evidence of post-mortal survival. Many may argue with the super psi hypothesis, hallucinations, etc., which are understandable objectives. And even the Center for Inquiry Investigation and Paranormal Challenge, which is like a 500,000 other people who claim telepathy or some stuff like that. The problem with that because it's based heavily on James Randi Foundation, where even one of the founders for Committee of Central Inquiry, Ray Hom, has stated that it's just a scam. It's not doing actual scientific peer review understanding. This is more of showboating, right? Not actual scientific approach. So I do question the legitimacy of their scientific integrity. Like again, this basically, as for now, I gotta put this into integration for more details and understanding about this familiar and why my fundamental disagreement on seeing Carroll's metaphysics mainly from the point of consciousness, if the understanding of consciousness. Bye.